I should point out that Dr. Goodwin, I don't believe, is finished with everything.
Oh, no, he's got other things to talk about. Okay.
Okay, but anyway, thanks for your input in that, and I'd also just like to thank the various members of the council just for your interest in the science. And this exchange, I think, is very, very good for us. The second item on the agenda, and all of these, of course, are so interrelated. This is just a brief update on the State Water Resource Control Board workshops for potential changes to the 2006 Water Quality Control Plan for the Bay Delta system, and we certainly appreciated Mr. Fiorini taking the time to attend the first workshop. So what's happening is that there's 3 workshops that the State Water Resource Control Board are hearing. The first one, which was held, was on ecosystem changes in the low salinity zone. As I mentioned last time, the State Board had asked us to convene an invited panel to start each of these workshops with a fairly detailed charge that was to try and give a statement, not to repeat what everybody's known before, but to have an independent group that had very broad representation, by discipline, by federal or state agency, NGO, water agencies, and also from their expertise of which part of the Delta system were they working on. Are they the Bay, the Delta, the contributing watersheds? And what the board had asked is to focus on what's new since 2010, the last time they ran a series of hearings. And so the invited panel really put a lot of effort into it, and I would certainly invite folks to look at the detailed PowerPoint that they had put together. And they divided their talk into hydrologic changes to the Delta, and then the ecosystem changes. And then the 2 parts which probably generated the most discussion that continued throughout the 2-day hearings was managing the Bay Delta for an uncertain future. So what would the role of science be in that? And also changing science for a changing Delta. So getting to Chair Eisenberg's problem, how should the way that we do science adapt as the problems become different, as things evolve? And so several of the panel members since that discussion have provided us with input on how that could possibly be done, and we're certainly including that in this first document on the science plan. So some of the highlights of that came out of the discussion. From the invited panel, there was some in terms of new data, there's the controversy going on about the role of turbidity and smelt and the exact role of that. So a group of the panel got together and analyzed the latest data and had some very interesting findings related to that. The second recommendation that came out of discussion that interspersed during both days and throughout many of the panels too was actually formulating the questions in a way that scientists could respond to. Because the natural reaction of a scientist is to talk from the body of knowledge right now, and they feel often very uncomfortable in projecting out beyond that. And then there was discussion on an adaptive policy framework that would adjust to the changing Delta. The next 2 workshops, on Monday and Tuesday next week, there's the Bay Delta Fishery Resources workshop. And then later in the month, there's workshop 3, which is looking at analytical tools for evaluating water supply, hydrodynamics, and hydropower. So this is taking a look at where we are right now, and with some of these more in-depth questions which are being asked, how can we be anticipating those, and what sort of tools should we be thinking about developing to answer some of these questions? And I should say that the way these are structured, I think it works very well. There are other panels representing the NGOs, Department of Water Resources, the Clean Water Agencies, SAC Regional Sanitation District, and the water users. So I'm not sure if there are any questions about those hearings or the various outcomes.
Questions? No.
Okay. In that case, I'll jump to the next item, and I may have interspersed these, but this is the full low Salinity Habitat Study Synthesis. The title is Year 1 of the Delta Fall Outflow Adaptive Management Plan. And I think I described this to you last time. This is the program, it used to be called Fall X2. And the reason there's so much interest focused on this is that the cost of conducting this in terms of water is very, very significant. But on the flip side, the potential benefits to the ecosystem are equally huge. So when these guidelines were first put in place, it was based on correlations and real data, of course. And much of the scientific attention since that was put in place is trying to develop a deeper understanding of the mechanisms that link moving the low salinity zone further down into the estuary and potential benefits to fish, particularly delta smelt. So the review panel, which was convened this year, did two things. One was to look at the initial results from the very major adaptive management plan that was put in place last year. And if you remember, Dr. Muller-Solger presented to you briefly just on the incredible achievement that was pulled together to put that monitoring plan in place last fall. And I think it truly is a great example of what the science community and the agencies can do. There's a focus there they pulled together, and it was truly a remarkable achievement. And the panel were very clear about that. As a member of the panel that previous year, we were pretty pessimistic that given the late stage that could be pulled off. But it really was a great tribute to the science community. There were 9 primary findings in the panel conclusions this year. This report is available now. I'll just pick out a few of these that I know this is very close to Mr. Fiorina's heart, is that the panel suggested that we should start a discussion on defining success for the fall outflow. So when is much better good enough? It would be another way of paraphrasing that. So when do you know when you've really achieved something? And that was the first thing. The second thing is that they commended the scientists working on it, that the conceptual model that drives all of the connections, so they put a conceptual model together to try and understand the connectivity in this very complex system. So you increase the flows, what are the responses likely to be? And then the idea is that you target the hypotheses and the data collection to understand the strength of those various connections. And so that they urged that the conceptual model that they thought was described very well in the report in words needed to be there in a figure that you could look at and adjust. The third major point that they made was, and this was the same point that had been made last year, that it was a tremendous achievement, but it was basically done on people's spare time. People put a lot of effort. It was done in a very short time frame. It put a lot of pressure on people. So they suggested that the leadership of the adaptive management program should be considered very carefully. And in the previous year, the recommendation is who's responsible, who's calling the shots when it comes to working across multiple entities. Related to that, they suggested that planning should start now for future modeling needs to improve the conceptual model. There should be plans to account for uncertainty. But also related to this, they made suggestions that we should start planning right now. So what do you do in a wet year? What do you do in above normal year? But also what do you do in a normal year? So that you can really understand comprehensively that role between the low salinity zone and the ecological benefits. The final thing that I would say about that panel, I was really struck by the openness of the federal and state agencies when they were reporting in front of the panel. And often your tendency as a scientist is to be a little hesitant and to be defensive. But the people who presented work, it was just a very open discussion. And they said, we just need to be better, we want to improve. And as far as we could tell, nothing was held back. So it was just a very nice open dialogue. So are there any questions on the FLASH studies?
No? No? I don't see any questions.
So with your permission, unless people are ready to, I just wanted to make a very quick announcement just so that you can see some of the broader activities. I wanted to talk very briefly about the PSP program. So you make a very large investment. That's the proposal solicitation package that goes out. And so you've heard us talk about the Science Fellows program, what we've been doing there. And typically in any of these grant programs, the people who are conducting the research, they will provide annual and final reports to our staff. Our staff stay engaged. We track the publications. We track the major findings. But we were given an invitation recently by a group at UC Davis, which we really embraced. And their suggestion was, we're about halfway through this program, and we're having all of our students together. Why don't you come down with some of your members of the science program and let's do a midterm review? And we thought this was great because, one, we get to know a lot more about the program. So it was a half-day presentations, half-day in the field. And it allowed for this very substantive debate in where they're going with their research. And they were asking for our advice. How is this really going to be useful? And so we really liked this model, and we may look to expand that. But I wanted to mention a little about the program. So if you attend the science conference, I would really encourage you to see the presentations. And so actually, I didn't mention to the folks at UC Davis that I was going to be speaking about this, but there's several features about the research. And so they have all of these qualifiers. We're still working on it. It's not ready for prime time. But there's some things there that I thought was a really good model. First of all, you could really look at your funding as providing seed funding. And so they took this funding and then they started looking for other sources to expand the research, particularly into the social sciences and the impact of various actions. The project was related to the yellow bypass, which is being looked at by many entities as a major place where we can get a major bang for investment in terms of ecosystem recovery. The second thing that they did which really struck us that they were building on what's been done, so they're not reinventing the wheel. They're working with people who've been doing studies out there. Thirdly, they were very intimately engaged with the farmers that are out there on the field. And because of that, they've been able to do some pretty significant tweaks to management of rice fields and how the land is actually used. And they seem to have developed this relationship with some of the landowners there where there's a lot of trust and this willingness to engage in experimentation. They also have Yolo County, and I mentioned this, heavily engaged. So what they're doing is taking the fundamental science, this knowledge that was developed by Ted Summer initially at the Department of Water Resources, that if you open up the floodplains, the growth of fish and the productivity in the food web, there's a major advantage to that. So they have the hydrodynamic modeling, they have the food web, all of the things that we expect from a science program, but they've actually taken that further through Professor Howitt, who's an internationally recognized agricultural economist. And what they've been doing is looking at various alternatives, and so how can you actually interpret that to understand the trade-offs? And it's just a very nice example of looking not just at the change in the agricultural produce, but looking at the knock-on effect. What does it mean in terms of your tax revenues, and how does it impact the economics of the county at a much wider level? So this is very much a work in progress, but I just thought that if you're going to be attending the science conference, you may want to take in those presentations. The very talented PhD student who seems to be leading the team is Robin Sudeth, Richard Howard, and many others. So I just wanted to highlight that if you're planning which parts of the conference that you may attend, I think you would really enjoy hearing those presentations.
Well, let's see, I don't know if you mentioned it. I think Randy's participating in a panel for the council at the conference. I'm going to try to attend various parts of it. And I think members have all gotten invitations. I think that's right. You've received invitations to that. Okay.
Thank you.
Is that it?
That's it.
I was out of the room briefly. Did you cover the ecological investigation study, the historic study in the Delta? Did you mention that? I noticed you had
We
slides.
had the graphic up, but never talked about it.
Yeah.
Okay, I would just like to make a few comments. This is truly an extraordinary study. So there's a PowerPoint here, and I don't intend to cover the breadth of this study, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of what's in it and why I think the scientific community as a whole think that this is going to be really a landmark study. So this is a historical ecological investigation of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. And it was supported, I should have put up here, the Department of Fish and Game, the Ecological Restoration Program. It's been in progress for several years. This is a hard copy of the report. And it's beautifully presented, it's very compelling, it's very well written. And one of the questions you may have is, why do we care about what's in the past? I think you've probably heard from many scientists, the landscape has changed to such an extent that it's irreversible. So why should we care about what was there in the past? And actually there's many reasons for doing that. The primary reason is that if we can understand what was there in the past, many of the indigenous species will have adapted to those conditions. So when we're with a landscape that's going to be subject in some areas to very, very large-scale, landscape-scale restoration activities, what do you actually put there? So if we know what was there in the past and how the native species adapted to what was there in the past, it gives us a template and some clues about how we can conduct restorations where maybe native species can outcompete invasives. Secondly, from my area, the physical process perspective, when you're looking at conducting these restoration activities, whether it's a floodplain restoration or a tidal wetland restoration, one of the very important processes there from the sustainability is, how does sediment get in and out of the system? What's sustainable in the long term? How does the land drain and flood? And that's very driven by the channels and the network of channels that are out there. So with the level of detail that has been put together here, it gives us a lot of information about what was there historically, what could be sustainable, so that we can then test our theoretical models against what was there to give us some confidence that the assumptions we're making in the models and in design procedures are going to be correct. So one of the suggestions that I might make here is, with the chair's permission, it would be really worth inviting these authors either to do a brown bag, or even if you were willing to take a half-hour break in one of your sessions here and have it webcast, because it really does tell a very compelling story.
I'm about 50 pages into it, and all I can say is we've already taken from them, with their permission, a couple of charts that we've included in the Delta Plan, particularly the historic comparison to contemporary development and so on. The charts are just remarkable. They're beautiful, and kind of a standard I'd hope the Delta Plan can meet. But the other thing that caught my attention immediately is they did a historic narrative of major impacts on the Delta from whenever. It was one of the most clearly written of all the things I've read. I think little of this will come as new to people who've spent a lot of time on this issue, but it is intelligently presented, and it is as close to a balanced and nuanced view that I've seen. Also, they in different words, but they echo the comments of the National Research Council back in March, that you can't return to the past. You can have an ecosystem that's improved and all of that, but we can't guarantee miracles that assume the disappearance of human civilization is somehow an option. And it's It just seems to me it's potentially a remarkable tool and resource to be used in a way that I may not understand it completely, but it's one of those things I expect to be referencing back to in the years to come. So I personally, for a future council meeting, I would think some representation on this and presentation would be in order. I would recommend that to you and to Chris on scheduling with the council's permission. Mm-hmm. Okay, good.
In that case, what I would suggest, I just put a summary together of the report, even it's new, but what I would suggest is I'll just pass over that because I couldn't possibly do it justice, and if you're willing to have it on the calendar in the future, I'll just, both Alison, who is now a PhD student at UC Davis, and Robin Grossinger have offered to come up with their team
none of the names up there are part of this, but in the acknowledgement section, I was just skimming through it. 3 members of the Independent Science Board are acknowledged as making special contributions. Our former Delta lead scientist, Cliff Dahm, our Chris Enright in the Delta Science program. I mean, and people you've heard testify many times. This is a compendium of very talented voices from a variety of sources. So
beautifully done. And so just one thing to add there, folks can see the San Francisco Estuary Institute, but I should also point out that Daniel is Department of Fish and Game.
Yes, they funded the effort. Good. Okay. Anything else, Dr. Goodwin?
No, except if you'd like to take a look.